Welcome back, Chess Kids, to YouTube, and if you want to be the best, you're going to learn from the best, and today we're going to revisit the Nakamura versus Carlsen rivalry. We've already seen Nakamura get the best of Magnus, but today we get to see Magnus dominate Hikaru, and in fact, both games we're going to look at are from classical chess. Before we jump into it, though, hit the subscribe button. Now, these two have played so many games. In fact, they once locked themselves in a hotel room late at night and played like 50 games in a row. But we're going to look at two of Magnus Carlsen's classical, that means slow chess wins. And this absolutely crazy position, I think, was the first ever decisive game the two ever played. It was about 10 years ago. And it's a really weird one, but Hikaru decides he really wants his queen to be on h4 to come after Magnus's king. So Hikaru plays knight to g2, and he doesn't care if he loses a pawn after bishop takes, pawn takes, because then the rook will be barreling down on the white king. And if white does nothing important, then the queen will join the attack on h4. That's the big idea. However, we have this lesson on ChessKid about wedge pawns, and Magnus doesn't need me to know about them because he played a fantastic wedge pawn here. He played pawn f6, and this pretty much seals black's fate because now the queen is never going to be able to get over to the king's side. And in fact, this bishop doesn't really have anywhere good to go either. But wait, you're saying, but master, you forgot there's two attackers and there's only one defender. No, I didn't forget. And neither did Magnus, because if Hikaru takes this pawn, that opens up the f file, and then queen f3 is just total devastation, because if you move your bishop anywhere, it is checkmate on the weak spot because Hikaru didn't castle. The rook cannot come to h6 to defend because that square is covered. And even if Hikaru finds some really clever defense, like rook h4, so if the queen takes after the queen's trade, then Hikaru will get the piece back. Then Magnus will play the sparkling bishop to g5. Look at how crowded this diagonal has gotten, and it's a fork of the bishop and the rook. And of course, if you take this, it is still checkmate. You probably did not need me to tell you that. So if we go back to this position, Hikaru decided to bring the bishop back to f8, but that totally ends black's attack and pretty much seals the fate of black. So Magnus played the move queen to f3, just securing this pawn and developing a little bit more. Queen c7. Now for the first time, it looks like the black king is going to get himself out of the middle of the chessboard. However, Magnus realizes this and plays the move knight to b4. Now, if black castles, nothing will be guarding this pawn for starters. So, knight to b7, it looks like Hikaru's trying to reroute the knight and defend the pawn in the process. But now, knight c6, you're never going to get rid of that knight on the outpost. You're never going to be able to castle your king because you can't castle through a square that your opponent is attacking. And now all that's left is for white's pieces to amass around the black king. Here's the remainder: knight to c5, bishop to f5, further making sure that black king will never castle. In fact, now he can't even move at all. Knight to d7, attacking this pawn, but Magnus simply guards the pawn. Rook to g8. Now the queen comes to the square h5, and there's pressure against the f7 pawn. So the knight moved to b6 to protect the pawn, but now the very pretty putting pp on the pp, bishop to e6. And let me tell you how bad this position is for black. First of all, if black does nothing, white's going to play the very pretty knight to e7, blocking the queen's protection of the pawn, and then the queen will just take on the next turn. But how bad is this position? Well, the computer's number 2 move for black is queen to d7. Giving a queen for a bishop. That is the number 2 suggestion. The number 1 suggestion is what Hikaru played, although it doesn't really help too much. After rook takes bishop to slightly distract the queen simply took back, and Hikaru tried to take, but after takes, now he had to resign because f7 is just such a big threat. Even if you take this thinking you're going to be able to do some damage, no, it's going to be mate with a pawn. So in this position, Hikaru had to throw in the towel even before capturing the knight. Their first ever classical decisive game went to Magnus. Now, let's take a look at one more very quick decisive game. And this is very much in Magnus's style. This came several years later in St. Louis, and the game looks about equal. Both sides have 4 pawns, and although white has a protected pass pawn, it's totally blockaded. But this is the kind of game that Magnus just finds a way to win. Now, Hikaru was black. He did not like playing passive defense, so he switched to active defense. He said, here, take my pawn. So Magnus said, okay. And then the rook comes and gives check. And now the problem for white is, how do you get this pawn going and make sure you don't lose your base pawn and all the other pawns along with it? Well, it takes Magnus a bunch of moves, but let's just sit back and enjoy Magnus being Magnus. He gets out of the checks, and then he has to re-maneuver his king. So he uses the rook as a shield. This is actually going to be a theme. Now the king can walk to the second rank, and here comes the king. Now he's making sure he keeps an eye on his f3 base pawn in case it ever gets attacked. He walks his king up the board. He shields his king more with his rook. Now, how does the king cross over to help join? Well, he's going to use the rook again. So the rook comes up, and then eventually the rook comes over. The rook is again a shield or a bridge or whatever you want to call it. Now, that might cost him this pawn eventually, but it's so useful to get the king in the game that even after losing his base pawn, he crawls into the position, and now with the black king in such a bad spot, he walks his king in, he plays the move king to g6, and the black king is in such terrible shape that even though white is now down a pawn, white is totally winning. Only 2 more moves happen. The rook moved over to a4. I guess it could have captured this pawn, doesn't really matter. And then after rook to h7 check, black actually resigned, because after the only legal move, king to g8, now the rook will just swing all the way over. It could really land anywhere. Let's just say, I don't know, e7 is actually probably the most accurate move. Now, we're threatening mate, and if your king takes a little walk, the pawn will promote. And if you play a move like rook back, now in this position, the king can just take everything. You can just play king takes f6. You're going to lose this pawn. You're going to lose this pawn. And a rook and 2 connected pawns is pretty much always winning. So that is why Hikaru resigned. So we had a crazy middle game, and we had a very typical Magnus endgame, both showing off his prowess in chess. He can win in any kind of position, and I look forward to these two battling it out for many more years to come.